The autumn mud of the Western Front, November 1917. The war, promised to be over by Christmas, was already in its fourth year, devouring millions of lives in the senseless meat grinder of trench warfare. The positional stalemate seemed insurmountable, until, in the pre-dawn gloom of November 20th, they appeared near the French town of Cambrai. 445 steel monsters called tanks moved on German positions without traditional artillery preparation. A new chapter in the history of warfare was beginning. The British command decided on an unprecedented step: the massive use of armored vehicles to break through the impregnable Hindenburg Line. 3 years of bloody attacks had yielded no results, but now technology was supposed to change the rules of the game. The Battle of Cambrai became the first in history where the main role was played not by manpower, but by mechanized power. This day forever changed the perception of modern warfare and laid the foundation for future concepts of blitzkrieg, deep operations, and tank wedges, which would define the face of the next World War. By 1917, trench warfare had become a nightmare for all belligerents. Kilometers of trenches, millions of shells, and hundreds of thousands dead, all for an advance of a few hundred meters. The classic tactic of infantry attacks after artillery preparation no longer worked. The enemy had time to bring up reserves while artillery shelled their positions for hours, then mowed down the attackers with machine gun fire. Something fundamentally new was needed. A machine capable of overcoming trenches, wire obstacles, and simultaneously protected from bullets and shrapnel. Thus was born the idea of the tank, an armored fighting vehicle on tracks. The first experiments began as early as 1915, when British Colonel Ernest Swinton proposed using armored tracked tractors to break through German lines. The idea was supported by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, who created the Land Ship Committee. The name tank emerged as a code word to maintain secrecy. Factory workers were told they were assembling mobile water tanks for Russia. The first models, named Mark I, were imperfect, slow, unreliable, with minimal crew comfort. Inside there was unbearable heat, deafening noise, and exhaust fumes poisoned the air. Crews often became incapacitated even before encountering the enemy. But engineering thought did not stand still. By the time of the Battle of Cambrai, the British had developed the fourth modification, the Mark IV. These machines weighed 28 tons, reached speeds of up to 6 kilometers per hour, and carried either two 57mm cannons and 3 machine guns, males, or only 6 machine guns, females. Their 12mm thick armor protected against bullets, but remained vulnerable to artillery. Their main advantage was the ability to overcome trenches up to 2.5 meters wide and crush wire obstacles with their body weight. Mark IV tanks, despite all their shortcomings, were a true technological breakthrough of their time. They embodied the industrial might of the British Empire and the engineering ingenuity of its designers. The Germans, encountering the first tanks at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, were shocked. One German officer wrote, "These steel monsters caused superstitious terror among our soldiers. It seemed as if not men, but demonic machines, invulnerable to ordinary weapons, were fighting against us." However, at that time, tanks were used sporadically, in small groups, which did not provide a decisive advantage. The British command learned lessons from this experience. By November 1917, a plan for the massive use of armored vehicles matured. To concentrate hundreds of machines on a narrow sector of the front and deliver a sudden strike without preliminary artillery preparation. Thus was born the concept that, 20 years later, would transform into the famous Blitzkrieg. On the cold morning of November 20th, 1917, General Julian Byng stood before a map of the Cambrai sector, aware of the historical significance of the coming day. His plan was audacious to the point of recklessness: to use 445 tanks in a concentrated attack on German positions without preliminary artillery preparation. Such a thing was unprecedented in world military history. Traditional doctrine demanded days of artillery bombardment of enemy positions, but this always gave the Germans time to prepare to repel the attack. Byng decided to flip the script. Surprise became the British main weapon. The tanks were to emerge from the pre-dawn mist, like ghosts, bringing with them shock and terror. The operation was prepared under conditions of unprecedented secrecy. Tanks were moved to the front line only at night, hiding during the day in forests and villages under camouflage nets. Crews received instructions at the last moment. Even high-ranking officers of the British Army were not privy to the full details of the operation. Any leak of information could lead to disaster. German intelligence, although reporting unusual movement behind the front line, failed to decipher the enemy's true intentions. The British skillfully created false targets, simulating preparations for an offensive in other sectors of the front. Mark IV tanks were divided into 3 assault groups, each assigned specific objectives. The first wave was to create passages through wire entanglements and suppress advanced machine gun posts. The second was to overcome the main line of German trenches and advance deep into the defense. The third was to exploit the success, capturing artillery positions and headquarters. Following the tanks, infantry was to consolidate the achieved gains. The British command expected a breakthrough of the front up to 8 kilometers deep on the first day, an unthinkable achievement by the standards of trench warfare. Engineers developed special fascines, large bundles of brushwood that tanks carried and dropped into trenches, creating crossings for subsequent vehicles. Each tank was equipped with pigeon post, the only reliable means of communication in combat conditions. Crews underwent intensive training, practicing interaction with infantry and overcoming various obstacles. General Byng personally inspected the exercises, delving into all the details of the upcoming operation. On the evening before the offensive, commanders of tank units gathered for a final briefing. Colonel John Fuller, one of the main developers of tank tactics, addressed the officers. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we write a new page in military history. For the first time, machines, not men, will be the spearhead of the attack. Not only the outcome of tomorrow depends on your courage and skill, but also the future of military art." That night, few tankmen slept. Mechanics made final checks of engines, guns, and machine guns. Commanders studied maps and aerial photographs of German positions. Ordinary crew members wrote letters home. Many of them understood that they might not return from this risky endeavor. Mark IV tanks, despite all improvements, remained unreliable machines. Their engines overheated, tracks came off on difficult terrain, and their armor could not withstand a direct hit from an artillery shell. But the British command had no other choice. 3 years of bloody battles had not brought a decisive turning point. Something radically new was needed, and tanks were the only available means. At 5:30 in the morning of November 20th, 1917, the signal for attack was given. Hundreds of tanks roared forward, accompanied by thousands of infantrymen. The battle that would forever change the face of war had begun. At 6 o'clock in the morning on November 20th, 1917, the roar of hundreds of engines shattered the silence over the fields of Cambrai. Without a single artillery shot, violating all canons of military art, 445 British Mark IV tanks moved towards the German positions. A thick fog enveloped the battlefield, concealing the approaching armada of steel machines. German sentries peered into the milky shroud, not understanding the source of the growing rumble. When the first tanks appeared from the fog, many defenders simply froze in shock. Nothing in their combat experience had prepared them for such a sight. Rhomboid silhouettes, spewing flames from their sponson guns and machine guns, inexorably advanced on the Hindenburg Line, which was considered impregnable. The first vehicles, equipped with special fascines, approached the wide anti-tank ditches and dropped huge bundles of brushwood into them, creating crossings for the following tanks. Other tanks, armed with special hooks, tore through wire obstacles, opening passages for the infantry. German machine gunners, who had mowed down waves of attacking infantry for years, now helplessly watched as their bullets ricocheted off the armor of the approaching monsters. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the first line of German fortifications had been breached on a front 10 kilometers wide. The tanks continued to move deep into the defenses, sweeping away strongholds and suppressing pockets of resistance. The British infantry following them occupied the captured positions, consolidating the success. By noon, British troops had advanced up to 8 kilometers deep, an unprecedented result after 3 years of positional stalemate. The villages of Ribecourt, Marcoing, and Havrincourt, key strongholds of the German defense, fell one after another. The German command was in disarray. The traditional scheme of repelling attacks did not work. There was no prolonged artillery preparation which would have given time to bring up reserves. The tanks broke through the front so quickly that the defense system simply collapsed. Communication between German units was disrupted. Commanders did not understand the scale of the catastrophe. The British tank breakthrough caused a domino effect. Panic spread through German positions, many units retreated without orders. Shocked prisoners spoke of the overwhelming terror that gripped soldiers at the sight of approaching armored vehicles. One German officer later wrote, "This was the end of war as we knew it. Against men of flesh and blood, mechanical monsters now fought, invulnerable to rifles and machine guns." By the evening of the first day of the battle, the British had captured over 5,000 prisoners and 100 guns, losing only 4,000 men, a negligible figure by the standards of the bloody battles of the First World War. However, not everything went according to plan. Almost a third of the tanks broke down due to mechanical failures without reaching the German positions. Others got stuck in shell holes or overturned on difficult terrain. The crewers suffered from unbearable conditions inside the vehicles. Temperatures rose to 50 degrees, exhaust gases poisoned the air, and the roar of the engine and guns deafened the tankers. Many lost consciousness right at the controls. But even with all the difficulties, the first day of the Battle of Cambrai was a triumph of a new military concept. For the first time in history, mechanized forces proved their superiority over traditional infantry and artillery. The Hindenburg Line, considered impregnable, was breached in a few hours. The British Mark IV tank represented a true breakthrough in engineering thought of its time. Weighing 28 tons, this rhomboid machine could traverse trenches up to 2.5 meters wide, thanks to its elongated shape and tracks running around the entire perimeter of the hull. An engine with 105 horsepower allowed it to reach speeds of up to 6 kilometers per hour. Not impressive by modern standards, but sufficient for accompanying infantry on the battlefield. Tanks were divided into two types: males, armed with two 57mm cannons and 3 machine guns, and females, with 6 machine guns. This division allowed for an effective distribution of tasks. Males destroyed enemy fortifications and artillery, while females suppressed infantry. 12mm thick armor reliably protected the crew from bullets and shrapnel, but remained vulnerable to direct hits from artillery shells. Inside the tank, conditions were truly hellish. 8 crew members worked in a cramped space filled with exhaust fumes, deafening engine noise, and unbearable heat. The temperature inside the hull often reached 50 degrees Celsius, and the concentration of carbon monoxide was such that many tankers lost consciousness right during battle. The lack of shock absorption turned every bump into an agonizing ordeal for the spine. Crew commanders often compared being in a tank to a ride in a red-hot oven that is continuously being hit with a sledgehammer. The main technical achievement of the Mark IV was its ability to overcome obstacles impassable for infantry under fire. To cross wide trenches, tanks were equipped with fascines, huge bundles of brushwood weighing up to 1.5 tons, which were dropped into the ditch, forming an improvised bridge. Special hooks on the hull allowed barbed wire to be torn, creating passages for the infantry following the tanks. Interaction with artillery was revolutionary for its time. Instead of the traditional hours-long shelling of enemy positions, which would reveal offensive plans, the British employed the tactic of a creeping barrage. Artillery opened fire simultaneously with the start of the tank attack, progressively shifting it deeper into the enemy's defense, clearing the way for armored vehicles. This provided the effect of surprise and prevented the Germans from bringing up reserves. Communication between tanks and infantry was carried out using primitive but effective means: signal flags, flare guns, and pigeon post. Each tank carried several homing pigeons on board, which delivered dispatches to headquarters even if wired communication was completely disrupted. To coordinate actions, bright geometric shapes were painted on the tank turrets, allowing infantry to identify their vehicles from a distance. Despite the technological breakthrough, the first tank units faced serious problems. Mechanical reliability left much to be desired. Almost a third of the machines broke down due to malfunctions before reaching the enemy line. Tracks came off during sharp maneuvers, engines overheated, and the transmission could not withstand prolonged stress. The cruising range was only 35 kilometers, which severely limited operational capabilities. The first day of the Battle of Cambrai brought the British unprecedented success, but subsequent events showed how thin the line between triumph and defeat truly is. On the morning of November 21st, command faced a critical problem: how to exploit the breakthrough. The tank fleet had suffered serious losses. Out of 445 vehicles that began the attack, over 130 were out of action due to mechanical failures, and another 70 or so were hit by German artillery. The crews of the remaining tanks were at their physical limit. After a day in hot, exhaust-filled machines, many tankmen could not continue the fight. General Byng faced the classic problem of a breakthrough: a lack of fresh reserves to exploit the success. The cavalry, which was supposed to pass through gaps in the German defenses, could not operate effectively on the cratered terrain. Infantry units advanced too slowly, falling behind the offensive schedule. Logistical problems exacerbated the situation. The delivery of ammunition, fuel, and provisions to forward units was extremely difficult due to broken roads and a lack of reliable communication. Commanders of forward units sent reports via pigeons, but many birds did not reach headquarters. The radio communication of the time was unreliable, and telephone wires were constantly severed by artillery fire. The German command, having recovered from the initial shock, acted decisively. General von der Marwitz, commander of the Second Army, immediately transferred reserve divisions to the breakthrough site. By the evening of November 21st, the Germans began counterattacks on the flanks of the British salient. By November 23rd, the British offensive had completely run out of steam. Tanks that could still move experienced an acute shortage of fuel and ammunition. The infantry, deprived of artillery support, could not advance further. The Germans hastily formed special anti-tank teams, armed with heavy rifles and field guns, which fired directly at the vulnerable points of British machines. On November 30th, what the British command feared most happened: a powerful German counterblow. 20 German divisions, including elite storm troops, attacked the stretched British positions. Using a new infiltration tactic, German assault groups seeped between strongholds, surrounding and destroying isolated British units. By the end of the day, the Germans had recaptured most of the lost territory, taking 6,000 prisoners and hundreds of guns. British tanks, left without infantry cover, became easy prey for anti-tank teams. On December 7th, the battle officially ended. The front line practically returned to its original position. The tactical success of the British turned into a strategic draw. Losses on both sides were roughly equal, about 45,000 people. However, the main lesson of Cambrai was not in territorial gains or losses. For the first time in military history, it was proven that the correct application of armored vehicles could break through even the most fortified enemy defenses. The problem lay in developing this breakthrough in the absence of mobile reserves capable of quickly advancing behind the tanks. The German command was shocked by the sudden appearance of hundreds of armored vehicles on the battlefield at Cambrai. The first hours of the battle on November 20th, 1917, caused genuine panic in the Stabi. Colonel Bruchmüller, one of the leading artillery experts of the Kaiser's army, later recalled, "We encountered an enemy against whom our usual defensive measures proved powerless." This was a moment of truth for German military doctrine. However, the Germans quickly adapted to the new threat. By the evening of the first day of battle, the commander of the Second Army, General von der Marwitz, issued an order to form special anti-tank teams. In each infantry battalion, groups of 15 to 20 soldiers were assigned, armed with anti-tank rifles, bundles of grenades, and light field guns. These teams received a simple but effective instruction: concentrate fire on the tracks and observation slits of tanks, shoot only from close range, and attack vehicles from the side or rear, where the armor was thinner. Artillerymen were ordered to allocate guns for direct fire. Field 77mm cannons were hastily moved to the front line and camouflaged in special shelters with a good view of the terrain. Armor-piercing shells, previously used against fortifications, were now intended for combating tanks. Engineering units were tasked with creating a new system of anti-tank obstacles. Instead of continuous lines of trenches, the Germans began to build island defenses, a system of separate fortified strongpoints, between which were minefields and specially designed anti-tank ditches. These ditches had a vertical wall on the enemy's side, making them impossible to overcome even for tanks with fascines. The German command learned valuable lessons from the British tactics of surprise. General Ludendorff, the de facto head of the German armed forces, wrote in his memoirs, "Cambrai showed us that the massive use of new technical means combined with tactics of surprise can give a decisive advantage. We had to learn from the enemy." The battle accelerated the development of Germany's own tanks. The A7V project, begun as early as 1916, received top priority. This 30-ton machine with an 18-man crew, armed with a 57mm cannon and 6 machine guns, was intended to be the answer to the British Mark IVs. However, the complexity of the design and a shortage of resources allowed only 20 machines to be produced before the end of the war. Understanding the limitations of their own tank production, the Germans focused on capturing and utilizing British tanks. Special teams received bonuses for each enemy tank evacuated from the battlefield. Captured vehicles were studied by engineers, repaired, and incorporated into German assault units. The most important consequence of Cambrai for German military thought was the development of the deep defense concept. Instead of rigidly holding the front line of trenches, the Germans began to create an echeloned defense up to 10 to 15 kilometers deep. Forward positions were occupied by a minimal number of troops, with the main forces located in the second and third echelons, ready to counterattack after the enemy's offensive momentum had been exhausted. Special attention was paid to the training of stormtrooper groups, small, mobile units armed with light machine guns, flamethrowers, and mortars. These groups were trained to penetrate gaps in the defense created by enemy tanks and attack armored vehicles from the rear and flanks. The French command closely followed the events at Cambrai, recognizing the revolutionary nature of the British tank breakthrough. While the British relied on heavy rhomboid Mark tanks, the French chose a different path for armored force development. Colonel Jean-Baptiste Estienne, dubbed the father of French tank forces, analyzing the experience of Cambrai, concluded that it was necessary to create light, maneuverable vehicles capable of operating in close cooperation with infantry. Not giant fortresses on tracks, but fast and numerous steel cavalry should become the basis of a modern army, he wrote in a report to the Ministry of War in January 1918. This vision resulted in the revolutionary light tank Renault FT, a machine weighing only 6.5 tons with a two-man crew and a rotating turret. It was the rotating turret, first used on a production tank, that became the main innovative solution, defining the face of tank building for decades to come. Unlike the clumsy British rhomboids, the Renault FT could quickly change the direction of fire without turning the entire hull. French military thought, analyzing the reasons for the temporary nature of the success at Cambrai, emphasized two key aspects: the mass use of armored vehicles and the speed of developing the breakthrough. General Henri Pétain, commander-in-chief of the French army, noted, "The British showed that tanks can break through defenses, but they could not prove that they are capable of developing this breakthrough. Our task is to create mechanized units that not only breach the gap, but also rapidly penetrate deep into enemy positions." This concept was reflected in production plans. By the end of the war, France had produced more than 3,000 Renault FT tanks, which allowed for the formation of entire tank divisions. Among the French military theorists who pondered the lessons of Cambrai, a special place was occupied by a young officer, Charles de Gaulle, the future leader of Free France, and at that time an infantry captain, while in German captivity, carefully studied reports of the tank battle. After the war, he developed the concept of mechanized units in his book Towards a Professional Army, published in 1934. Cambrai showed that the future belongs not to trench warfare, but to mobile, mechanized units capable of delivering lightning-fast strikes deep into enemy defenses, de Gaulle wrote. He proposed creating elite tank divisions staffed by professional soldiers and equipped with modern technology. These units were to act as a steel fist, breaking through enemy defenses and developing success to operational depth. Unfortunately, the conservative French military leadership of the interwar period did not appreciate de Gaulle's progressive ideas. While Germany actively developed the concept of blitzkrieg, French military doctrine remained focused on static defense, embodied in the Maginot Line. Tanks were primarily considered a means of infantry support, not an independent strike force. Only individual officers, such as General Jean-Marie Dumanque, tried to implement the ideas of maneuver warfare. In 1937, under his leadership, the first French light mechanized divisions were formed, but their organizational structure and tactical methods were significantly inferior to the German panzer divisions. Nevertheless, the French experience of comprehending the lessons of Cambrai was not in vain. The design solutions developed and embodied in the Renault FT tank had a huge impact on world tank building. The classic layout with a rotating turret became the standard for most 20th century tanks. And de Gaulle's theoretical works, although not applied in France, were carefully studied by military theorists in other countries, including Germany. The tragic irony of history was that the Germans learned the lessons of Cambrai better than the Allies themselves. The Battle of Cambrai proved to be a turning point for British military doctrine. The command, realizing the potential of armored vehicles, decided to create a specialized unit, the Royal Tank Corps, officially formed in July 1917, even before the famous breakthrough. However, it was the successes and failures at Cambrai that determined the further development of this new military structure. Colonel John Frederick Charles Fuller, who served as Chief of Staff of the Tank Corps, became a key figure in understanding the experience of the battle. Analyzing the reasons why the initial success could not be developed into a strategic victory, Fuller developed the concept of Plan 1919. This revolutionary document envisioned the massive use of tanks, operating in close cooperation with aviation, for a deep breakthrough of enemy defenses and the destruction of its command posts. Tanks must operate not as individual combat units, but as a single mechanized organism, Fuller wrote. Their goal is not to capture territory, but to defeat the brain of the enemy army, headquarters and communication nodes. The war ended before this plan could be implemented, but the ideas embedded in it became the foundation of British military thought in the interwar period. Another outstanding theorist who developed the concepts of tank warfare was Captain Basil Liddell Hart. Studying the experience of Cambrai, he formulated the principle of indirect actions, a strategy aimed at disorganizing the enemy by unexpected strikes at vulnerable points, rather than frontal attacks on fortified positions. The Battle of Cambrai proved that a direct attack, even with the use of the latest technical means, has limited success, Liddell Hart noted. The true art of war lies in avoiding the enemy's strengths and attacking its weaknesses. In the 1920s, the British Army conducted a series of experimental exercises during which various aspects of the use of tank formations were practiced. The maneuvers of 1920 synthetic to 1928 were particularly significant when the experimental mechanized force was formed under the command of Colonel Fuller. This formation, which included tanks, motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and communications units, became the prototype of future tank divisions. However, the development of British armored forces faced serious obstacles. The economic crisis and the policy of reducing military spending led to limited funding. Conservative-minded command, especially representatives of the cavalry, resisted radical changes in the army structure. Tanks were viewed by many high-ranking officers only as an auxiliary means of infantry support, and not as an independent striking force. Despite these difficulties, the theoretical developments of British military thinkers continued to influence the development of tank forces worldwide. The works of Fuller and Liddell Hart were translated into other languages and carefully studied by military specialists from different countries. For Eastern Europe, the Battle of Cambrai was a revelation, fundamentally changing perceptions of modern warfare. Poland, restoring its statehood after more than a century of partitions, and revolutionary Russia, engulfed in the flames of civil war, meticulously studied the experience of the first massive tank attack. Polish military theorists, shaping the concept of national armed forces, saw tanks as a tool capable of compensating for the numerical superiority of potential adversaries. General Tadeusz Kuczeba, one of the architects of Polish military doctrine, wrote in his 1921 memorandum, "The experience of Cambrai proves that even a limited number of armored vehicles, used in the right place and at the right time, can neutralize the enemy's advantage in manpower." In Russia, despite the revolutionary upheavals, military specialists carefully analyzed Western experience. Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky, a young commander of the Red Army studying materials on the Battle of Cambrai, came to radical conclusions about the future of war. In his works of the early 1920s, he wrote, "Tanks are not just a new weapon for infantry support, but the basis of a fundamentally new form of armed struggle, where the decisive role is played not by positional confrontation, but by deep maneuver." It was in Soviet military thought that the lessons of Cambrai received their most revolutionary development. Vladimir Kyriakovich Triandafilov, one of the leading theorists of the Red Army, in his fundamental work, The Nature of Operations of Modern Armies, formulated the concept of deep operation. He wrote, "The British at Cambrai showed the possibility of a tactical breakthrough, but failed to turn it into an operational success. Our task is to create mechanized formations capable not only of breaking through the front, but also of rapidly developing the breakthrough to a depth of 100 to 150 kilometers." Unlike Western theorists, Soviet military leaders immediately proposed using tanks not only for breaking through defenses, but also for developing success. Tukhachevsky insisted on creating echeloned tank groups. The first echelon of heavy vehicles was to break through enemy fortified positions. The second echelon of medium tanks was to develop the breakthrough, and the third echelon of light tanks and motorized infantry was to consolidate the achieved success. In 1929, the first mechanized formations were created in the Red Army, and by the mid-1930s, the theory of deep operation was officially adopted as the basis of Soviet military doctrine. The 1936 field regulations prescribed, "Tank formations must act en masse in the direction of the main attack, with the aim not only of breaking through the tactical defense zone, but also of disorganizing the entire operational depth of the enemy." However, the Polish and Soviet approaches differed significantly in practical implementation. Poland, limited in resources, relied on light and medium tanks, intended primarily for infantry and cavalry support. The Soviet Union, possessing a powerful industrial base, developed a full range of armored vehicles, from light reconnaissance tanks to heavy assault vehicles. It is particularly interesting that both countries paid paramount attention to the interaction of tanks with aviation, an aspect insufficiently developed in the Battle of Cambrai. Tukhachevsky wrote, "Air reconnaissance and assault aviation must become the eyes and the long arm of tank formations, providing them with information about the enemy and suppressing his anti-tank weapons." The tragedy was that many progressive ideas were not fully implemented by the beginning of World War II. In Poland, the conservative command continued to rely on cavalry, and in the USSR, the Stalinist repressions of 1937 to 1938 destroyed most of the theorists of deep operation, including Tukhachevsky and Triandafilov. Their ideas were temporarily forgotten, which led to catastrophic consequences in the initial period of the war. While the great powers of Europe fought bloody battles on the fields of World War I, Spain remained aloof from the conflict, maintaining neutrality. However, this did not mean a lack of interest in revolutionary changes in warfare. The Spanish Ministry of War closely followed developments, sending observers to various sections of the front. The Battle of Cambrai sparked particular interest in Madrid. Colonel Miguel Campins, who headed the Spanish military mission in France, received permission to visit the combat zone shortly after the British breakthrough. In his detailed report, sent in December 1917, he wrote, "We witnessed the birth of a new era of military art. Steel machines, overcoming obstacles and invulnerable to small arms fire, are capable of fundamentally changing the nature of future conflicts. Spain cannot remain aloof from these changes." Another Spanish observer, Captain Vicente Rojo, future chief of the General Staff of the Republican Army during the Civil War, was stunned by the scale of armored vehicle deployment. The British used not individual machines, but an entire armada, operating according to a single plan. This is not just a new weapon, but a new concept of combat. The reports of Spanish military experts sparked lively discussions in officer circles. The Spanish army, which had not participated in major conflicts since the late 19th century, was in dire need of modernization. The experience of Cambrai provided a unique opportunity to adopt advanced ideas without the bloody cost of its own mistakes. In January 1918, a closed conference of the High Command was held in Madrid, dedicated to the lessons of the tank battle. General José Marina, Spain's Minister of War, stated, "Our neutrality gives us an advantage. We can learn from others' victories and defeats. Tanks and mechanized units must become part of our military doctrine." However, from theoretical discussions to practical steps lay a long road. Spain, economically exhausted even without participating in the war, could not afford large-scale purchases of armored vehicles. The first French-made Renault FT tanks appeared in the Spanish army only in 1921, when King Alfonso XIII personally approved the acquisition of a small batch of these machines for use in the colonial war in Morocco. It is interesting that Spanish military analysts paid particular attention not only to the technical aspects of the Battle of Cambrai, but also to the psychological impact of tanks on the enemy. Major Juan Vigon noted in his study, "The moral effect of the appearance of these steel monsters on the battlefield cannot be overestimated. Even experienced soldiers panicked at the sight of approaching machines. In our colonial campaign against the Riffian tribes, such a weapon could be decisive." In the interwar period, Spanish military thought was divided into two camps. Traditionalists, represented mainly by veterans of the Moroccan campaigns, considered tanks an expensive toy, ill-suited for the mountainous terrain of the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. Modernists, among whom Colonel José Asensio stood out, insisted on the creation of full-fledged mechanized units modeled on the leading European powers. The Civil War of 1936–39 became a cruel test of Spanish theories. Both sides of the conflict received tanks from their foreign allies, the Republicans Soviet T-26s, the Francoists German PZ-1 and Italian CV-335s. The fields of Spain became a testing ground for tactical concepts, many of which stemmed from the analysis of the Battle of Cambrai. The Battle of Cambrai became a bridge between two eras of warfare. Its lessons, paid for with the blood of thousands of soldiers, formed the basis of military doctrines that shaped the face of the next global conflict. The path from the first clumsy steel rhomboids of the Mark IV to the lightning-fast tank wedges of World War II took only 2 decades. But how intense those years of searching and experimentation were. Germany, defeated in World War I, drew perhaps the most profound lessons from Cambrai. Restricted by the Treaty of Versailles in army size and forbidden to openly develop armored forces, it secretly developed the concept of the Blitzkrieg, lightning war. General Heinz Guderian, having carefully studied the works of British theorists Fuller and Liddell Hart, created a doctrine in which tanks acted not as an auxiliary means for infantry, but as an independent strike force. "Do not disperse, but concentrate," Guderian wrote in his book, Achtung Panzer. Act not in small groups, but massively, in the direction of the main thrust. These principles directly harked back to the experience of Cambrai, but were further developed. The Germans added two new elements to the equation: air support and radio communication. What the British so lacked in November 1917, the ability to coordinate the actions of tank formations in real time, became the cornerstone of German doctrine. The irony of fate. The country that first employed a massive tank strike was the least prepared for tank warfare 20 years later. The British military leadership, bound by tradition and financial constraints, failed to fully develop the ideas of its own outstanding theorists. When in May 1940, the German Panzerwaffe broke through the front in France and rushed towards the English Channel, the British Expeditionary Force was threatened with encirclement. The evacuation from Dunkirk saved the men, but not the equipment. The Soviet Union, which had experienced a period of repression that destroyed the creators of the deep operation theory, also faced catastrophic defeats at the beginning of the war. However, the basic principles laid down by Tukhachevsky and Triandafilov were not completely forgotten. After the harsh lessons of 41, the Red Army revived the concept of deep tank breakthroughs, which led to the creation of tank armies, formations of unprecedented strike power. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 43 became the apogee of tank confrontation in World War II. Thousands of armored vehicles converged in a deadly struggle in the expanses of central Russia. This Battle of Titans was a direct heir to the modest-in-scale Battle of Cambrai, which took place 26 years earlier. Even in the Pacific theater of operations, where geography limited the use of large tank formations, the lessons of Cambrai were reflected. American Marines, storming fortified Japanese positions on the islands, used Sherman tanks to break through defenses, just as the British used Mark IVs to overcome German wire entanglements. The legacy of Cambrai continues to live on in modern military doctrines. Operation Desert Storm in 1991, when American and Allied tank formations carried out a deep flanking maneuver against the Iraqi army, conceptually harked back to the ideas born on the battlefields of World War I. Thus, the first massive use of tanks, despite a tactical draw, became a strategic breakthrough in military art. Cambrai proved the future belongs not to trenches and barbed wire, but to speed, maneuver, and concentrated armored power. The lessons learned from this battle determined the face of 20th century wars and continue to influence military thought in the 21st century.